So it's the beginning of 2024, and I finally got around to building a new gaming PC. The last gaming PC lasted me 7 years with only a few minor upgrades and part replacements. So I want to make sure this new one would last just as long. And I also didn't do a completely full new build. I did bring over certain parts that I knew were reusable, such as the power supply, my capture card, and most importantly, the 3080 Ti graphics card. Now, all parts of the new PC build will be listed on my kit page, which is linked below, so be sure to go check that out. But the main highlights are a i9 13900K, Asus ROG Z790 motherboard, and 64 gigs of DDR5 RAM. And then I went from my main drive where my games, my operating system are stored, from a SATA solid state to a NVMe solid state. So it's a much faster drive, which means games load faster and can access their items faster, I guess. But outside the technical parts of it, I'm sure everybody wants to know, how well does it run? And so, because it's the same graphics card between the old build and the new build, I just decided to do a before and after comparison to see how much everything improves. And for this, I picked some very specific games because of how the games themselves play and also how I like to play them. So first, we have Ark Survival Evolved. This is the original version of the game, not the, Scorched Earth, anything like that. None of the expansions, just the original game, not the rehashed, upgraded visual ones, the old one. And on the old system, this one actually ran very well, despite the number of mods I was using, the number of modded elements to my base, and of course the number of creatures in my base. And for the most part, it kind of, it would stay typically around over 100 FPS in a lot of places, but around my base, there's a few places where it was suddenly really dropped to 50s to 60s in the FPS on the old build. The new build, of course, significantly higher, in most places significantly higher, but there's still a few places around my base where the FPS dropped down even as low as the 70s. So not a huge difference overall, but kind of surprising that it was that little of a difference in some places. So next, I decided to test with Planet Crafter because it's one of the games I've been playing a lot lately, and it uses a lot of items inside the game, which means a lot of performance hits to the FPS. Now, one thing about this is the FPS did not show up in the NVIDIA performance overlay, but it does have its own built-in FPS counter in the game, so that's enlarged and highlighted in the bottom right. So I decided to test this two ways. I tested it with a completely brand new game save, where literally walking out of the survival pod where you start the game. And on the old build and the new build, I was getting the maximum FPS of 145. Now, I'm sure realistically, I was getting higher than that, but 145 FPS is the maximum that the game counter will show. Next, I decided to do the existing game save, the one I've been doing in all our live streams for like the last year. And this one I wanted to use because there's some notable places where the FPS really plummets. Especially on the old system, such as around the butterfly farms. Now, most places, I still had even good FPS on the older system, but around the butterfly farms, I would see it drop down to like 20-25 FPS, just because of the number of butterflies being rendered on screen at a time. The new build, overall, most places, much higher FPS, but interestingly, around the butterfly farms, it still dropped as low as about 45 to 50 FPS overall around the butterfly farms. It did not stutter as bad, but there's still a significant FPS drop around 100 butterfly farms. So for the third game, I chose Starfield because, love it or hate it, Starfield is at least a game we know is going to test hardware. It's going to stress it a bit. Now, one problem I found, and I completely forgot of this happening when I was recording it, but Starfield does not play nice with OBS. At least it never has in my experience. So at my outpost, which is a pretty much barren world, nothing really going on the old build, I was getting 60 to 80 FPS, and it was playing smoothly at that rate. But in the video, there are some stutters that happen that were not actually there in the gameplay. Meanwhile, I fixed some of that on the new build when I noticed it happened. And the new build in the same spot, my outpost getting 110 to 130 FPS overall. But again, this is an outpost, not much going on, nothing really to tax it too much. New Atlantis, that's the real test. And so when I went to New Atlantis to test it, I kept the lower settings I was using on the older system, and it would get about 20 to 40 FPS. Again, having some extra stutters happening in the video footage that actually were not there in the gameplay, but it was a much lower FPS. Now on the new build, I decided to keep it the same lower graphic settings instead of suddenly tweaking everything higher. And with the same matching graphic settings, the new build got between 90 and 110 FPS in New Atlantis. So a big increase in FPS. However, one thing I want to note is so far, Starfield is the only game that has pushed my new i9 processor above 25% usage at any time. And it was only when I went to New Atlantis, and that only hit 45% usage. That's everything, including OBS running, Windows, everything running. It shot up to 45% utilization. Most games have been running at 15% utilization or less on the CPU. So Starfield did push it harder on my CPU, but in the end was limited by what the GPU was able to do. And of course, last, I couldn't get away from it. You know I had to test Subnautica. And so Subnautica, I decided to do the same test as I did with Planet Crafter. 2 saves, a brand new save right as you're in the survival pod, just getting out, swimming around at the beginning, nothing going on. And it is modded in that I have mods installed, but I'm not using any of the modded content yet. Now on the old and the new builds, both on a fresh game load, I was getting the range of 100 to 140 FPS pretty consistently. There was a few spots, I believe, on the old one that dipped down into 90s, but for the most part, brand new save, even with mods running, 100 to 140 FPS range typically. Now, when I loaded my current modded game save, which has a lot of modded content in it right now, on the old system, I was getting typically 15 to 20 FPS, but the new system, what's going to surprise many of you is it only shot up to 30 to 50 FPS range. Again, this is a lot of mods and a lot of modded content currently in that game. However, I don't have any of the mega-sized bases right now. So I haven't built big and crazy yet in the game. 3 relatively small bases, just a lot of modded content, and even with the new stuff, I only got 30 to 50 FPS. A new processor is helping, a much better speed loading games because I went to an NVMe SSD, but the biggest thing I think for me is in the end the motherboard. The old system, I used a Gigabyte board because at the time I bought it, I thought it was going to be good, and that Gigabyte board has had so many issues. I'll never buy another Gigabyte product again. It is that bad that it has turned me off completely from Gigabyte. So my new Asus board, not only is it look better quality, it's definitely better quality. The board itself, the motherboard, weighs almost as much as the empty case that is holding everything. It's that hefty of a board, and it's got so many extra little things on it that make it so nice. And because it's where everything plugs in, I feel like it's having one of the biggest improvements on everything overall. But in the end, upgrading your gaming hardware to fix performance issues is not a magic bullet. It's not going to always work. I've got games that I saw a big increase in FPS, and then there's still places in those games where it suddenly just plummets down, and there's only a moderate increase from the old build to the new build. And the builds are 7 generations apart at this point. In the end, really, a lot of the bottleneck came down to the 3080 Ti is now the limiting factor. It is in most cases being able to max out at 99% utilization while my i9 processor sits at 10 or 11%, which is the biggest shocking part for me. But really, in the end, you know, performance-wise, it comes down to the game and how optimized the game is. It comes down to the game engine and how good the game engine is at handling certain aspects of the game as it's programmed. But perhaps the biggest one is how you play the game. You can add a ton of mods and a ton of modded content, or just build big enough. Doesn't matter what game or game engine you got, you're going to run into FPS issues regardless of whatever hardware you put in it. So if you enjoyed looking at the comparison, or you just liked hearing about my new gaming build, hey, of course, hit that like button and comment below. Let me know what you think of the build. And hey, that subscribe button, because it flashes and everything when I say subscribe. And if you click it, you get a special thing, because you know you want to hit subscribe.